Okay, here's our first two practice ones. It says identify all the important information for the ellipse with the given equations. We're going to work on this one first, and then I'll have you work on the second one on your own. So on this first one, first thing I need to do is identify which formula I should be using, and you do that by figuring out which one has the bigger denominator. Well, the 16 is bigger than 10, so the 16 is my a squared, the 10 is my b squared, because a squared is always bigger. Then you want to look at, well, what's a squared partnered with? It's partnered with an x, so that means I am going to use my top formula. I'm going to use the x minus h squared over a squared plus y minus k squared over b squared is equal to 1. Well, we've got some stuff to start with here. I'm going to go ahead and start with a and b since I already have them written down. I know that 10 is in the position of my b squared, so that tells me that b squared has to be equal to 10. Well, to get b by itself, I have to square root, so b is equal to the square root of 10. Again, I don't need plus minus even though I applied the square root, because this is a situation where we're talking about distance. B is a distance. Then I'm going to go to my a. I know that 16 is in the position of my a squared. Well, in order to get a, I need to square root both sides. Square root of 16 is 4. So now I have found my a and my b. Two very important pieces that we'll need. Next thing I want to do, I'm going to go ahead and look for my h and my k. Well, if I look at where my h and my k are in my formula, the h is the number that's being added or subtracted from the x, and the k is the number that's being added or subtracted from the y value. So I need to go and look for my h. I have to ask myself, what's being added or subtracted from my x value? Well, there isn't anything, so that number would have to be a 0. And then my k is the number being added or subtracted from the y value. And when I look at that, I've got a 2 here. But now remember, you have to use the opposite of it, so my k is really a negative 2. So far I have a, b, h, and k. The only one that I'm missing is c. So I'm going to go ahead and use that formula we've written down a couple of times, that c squared is equal to a squared minus b squared. Well, when I plug that in, a squared, a is 4, b is the square root of 10. Well, when I square those, I'm going to have 16 minus 10. 16 minus 10 gives me a 6. And to get rid of the square, I have to square root, so c is going to be equal to the square root of 6. Now I have all of my individual little pieces here, all my letters. I can go through and identify what my important information is now. And I'm just going to go right down the list I have in my flip book. So my center is at hk. Well, I found h and k to be 0, negative 2. So I'm going to have 0, negative 2 for my center. Then my major axis length, that is going to be 2 times a. Well, my a value I have identified as 4. 2 times 4 is 8. My minor axis says I have to take 2 times b. Well, I identified b as the square root of 10, so I'm going to have 2 times the square root of 10. Now, when we're graphing this, we are actually going to need a decimal approximation. So if you want to do that now, you can, or you can wait until later. Doesn't matter which. And that's about 6.32. Next thing on my list says I need to have some vertices. And my vertices, my formula says I have to take h plus a. Well, when I look at my h, it's 0. 0 plus 4 is 4, so I'm going to have 4. And then it says I just keep my k the way it is, so I would have a negative 2. And I have to do the other one. It says I have h minus k. Well, h is 0, or h minus a, sorry. H is 0, and 0 minus 4 is negative 4, so I'm going to be at negative 4. My k, again, just stays the same, so it's going to stay as a negative 2. Then my co-vertices. My formula for that says I'm going to have h comma, so my h stays the same. I just need to plop my h in there and call it a 0. And then to get my x value, though, I have to do k plus b. So I have to do -2 plus the square root of 10. Now, if you need an exact answer, you have to write it as -2 plus the square root of 10 because we can't combine them. Or if you need a decimal, depending on if we're trying to graph this or not, then you can go ahead and do -2 plus the square root of 10, which is about 1.16. Then I need to do my other covertice. Tells me I'm going to do h again, so I have a 0, and then k minus b, so I'm going to have -2 minus that square root of 10. If you need an exact, you'll leave it as that. If you need a decimal approximation, then you'll type it in, and when you do that, you get about -5.16. So those would be my covertices, and then last, my focus, my foci. My first one says I have to do h plus c. Well, h is 0, c is the square root of 6, so I would have 0 plus the square root of 6, which is just square root of 6, and then k stays the same, it's -2. And then to get my second one, it says I have to do h minus c. Well, h is 0, c is that square root of 6, and 0 minus the square root of 6 is a negative square root of 6, and then my k value just stays. So for this ellipse, that's all of my key information that I would need. Okay, on this second one, I'm going to help you get it started because I've put kind of a challenge here. Now, right here, this 2 causes us a little bit of a problem because according to our formulas, we are not allowed to have a number up here. So what you really want to do is you want to think of this portion of the equation as 2/3 times x minus 3. Well, now according to our formulas, oh, there's a typo there. There should be a squared. According to our formulas, when we have an ellipse, we only want to have x minus 3, that quantity squared, divided by some number. So what you have to ask yourself is, right now, we have it times a number. So you've got to think, how can I change this multiplication into division? So, and you can go through some different scenarios. You could try dividing it by 2, dividing it by 3, but that's not going to give you the 2/3. What you have to do is think about fractions. How do I change multiplication into division when I'm working with fractions? And to do that, you would use the reciprocal. So I'm really going to write this as x minus 3 squared divided by 3/2, because if you look at how this works out, the long way, divided by 3/2, well, according to our rules for fractions, when we have division, we multiply by the reciprocal, and that gets us back to 2/3 times the x minus 3 squared. So for this equation, I'm first going to have you rewrite it. Keep that y minus 4 squared over 1, plus, instead of that equation, you're going to write it as x minus 3 squared over 3/2 is equal to 1. And now everything else still follows the same patterns. You need to find A, you need to find B, you need to find H, K, you need to find C. So C, I would start just by seeing if you can find the value of those letters. Don't plug them in until you check with me if you have all of the letters correctly. So go ahead and pause the video and see if you can find A, B, C, H, and K. Alright, I started out by pulling off my H and my K. H is always paired with my X, so I knew it was going to be this one. Took the opposite and I got H to be 3. My K is always paired with the Y. Take the opposite of it and I get K to be equal to 4. Then I had to decide A and B, which one's which. Well, A squared is always bigger, and 3/2 is bigger than 1, so I knew that 3/2 was equal to my a squared. That's where my a squared was. So I set that formula up, a squared equals 3/2. So went through and solved it, and when I rationalized it, I got the square root of 6 over 2, or about 1.22. Then I went through my b squared. 1 is where my b squared goes, so b squared has to equal 1. Went through and I solved that, and I got b equal to 1. Once I had a and b, I went ahead and I used that formula, and I plugged in my a, I squared it, subtract my b squared, and I ended up getting c to be the square root of 1/2. Rationalize that, it's square root of 2 over 2, or it's about 0.707. So double check to make sure you have all those letters, and if you have them all the same, now go ahead and decide which equation are you going to use, and then plug in those values. And remember, the equation that you use depends on this a. You have to ask yourself what value, what letter is the a matched up with. Okay, for this one, I decided that I was going to be using that top equation again, because in my formula over here, the a value was partnered with the x. So that tells me it's got to be that top formula in my flipbook. Then I went through and I filled in all my a, b, c's, h, and k's, and I simplified each of my values. So right over here is what I got for the information on all my important points.